gonna stop. Hi, I'm Jennifer Dawson. I'm the pastor at First Presbyterian Parsons and a graduate of Bright Divinity School. And I'm here with one of my Divinity School friends, and we're having a conversation because we found that life is radically different today than it was a few years ago, and our paths have diverged, but we have this question about God in common.
And I'm Naiomi Gonzalez. I'm a failed PhD student who has 3 masters, who's currently working as the world's worst babysitter. But hey, the kids are still alive, and they seem to, for some reason, like me. So I consider that a win. So I think that's all you can ask. I may not put the diapers on correctly, and I may argue and lose arguments to a 3-year-old, but hey, they're still alive. And that's all you can ask of me, literally, as a babysitter.
I remember you talking about how you didn't really want kids, so you being a babysitter is kind of a new experience, huh?
Yes, definitely. So I've learned how to put on diapers, both the disposable kind and the reusable kind. The reusable kinds are a bit difficult. You have to make sure that the cover of it covers everything, or pee will get everywhere. So I've learned that a few times. I've learned how to put on a onesie over a baby. I still don't think I do that really well, but yeah, you have to go straight over it, otherwise over their heads, otherwise it will just cover their face and they will get upset because they can't see. So yeah, those are some of the things I've learned as a new babysitter. A lot of parenting and babysitting involves common sense. Unfortunately, I don't really have much common sense, which is evidenced by the fact that I have 3 master's degrees, a lot of debt, and no career. But so that's also been a fun experience trying to develop common sense.
It's good to have some common sense. I don't have much. I bought a 120-year-old farmhouse, and I have a screwdriver. And I'm not really good at wielding that. So, I mean, common sense doesn't play into life all the time, right? But we can talk about questions of theology, which are really important, even if your house is falling down around you. And the question we wanted, or the baby's running around with its diaper undone and leaking urine, that happens a lot. But anyway, back to the pandemic. We are currently in the midst of the COVID pandemic. I think we're on the 2nd wave, or maybe it's the fall wave, or maybe it just keeps going. And yeah, I don't know.
You can't have a second wave. You can't have a second wave. The first one never ends.
And I don't think
this motto.
Yeah, I don't think anything's ended except the way we normally did things. It's really hard to function in this pandemic world. I serve a small church anyway, and we're now worshiping half of what we worshiped before. And I'm getting a lot of questions from the congregation and people in general. Is the pandemic God's judgment? And is this the last days? And have the people we've put in positions of authority, because they are greater sinners than others, caused us to be caught in this pandemic? And I drew that example from a Google search that I did before we started recording. And I asked, is this pandemic God's judgment? And I got everything from no to, well, if we behaved ourselves better, God wouldn't do this to us. So what do you think?
So yeah, like you mentioned, this certainly has been a year. This has been, for me at least, and I know for other people, a giant nightmare. There are some people who are trying to go on as usual, going to parties, going to concerts. But I think for most of us, we've kind of 6 months, 7 months in, however many months in, I can't do math, we've kind of figured out that the old way of doing things isn't quite working. And the numbers are massive. In the US alone, as of October 17th, which I think is today, over 8 million Americans have been, infected by COVID, and over 223,000 Americans have died. And, the people who've been impacted, who've been infected. I've known people who've been infected. The symptoms have ranged from, oh, I'm asymptomatic, things are great, or not great, but like, I didn't even know I had COVID till it ended, to people have to be hospitalized, and who even when they get better um, have still dealt with the after effects. And even people who haven't had, COVID, haven't been infected, they've been impacted in other ways. Furloughs are continuing. People are losing health insurance in the middle of a pandemic, which is, I don't know about anyone else, but I don't think that's the best time to not have health insurance. I'm one of those people that doesn't have health insurance during a pandemic, and I'm trying to see if I can get into the open marketplace. And so it's natural for people to have these types of questions like, why is this happening? Is the pandemic a judgment of God? And asking those questions isn't necessarily like a bad thing. I mean, we all want to have some type of meaning in our lives. And by asking these questions, we're trying to sort out what the heck is going on. And we're trying to add some meaning to what's going on. So, and, Christians aren't immune. We believe in a God, and so we think, oh, well, there has to be some sort of purpose. So asking these questions, I don't think is a bad thing. I think they are valid questions, and I think we should wrestle with them. The problem is that some of the answers aren't necessarily helpful and can actually be very oppressive. So, one of the answers, that I have a major problem with is the ones that are like, well, this pandemic is a punishment from God. God is punishing us because of gay rights, or even if you move to the left, God is punishing us because our nation is violent and imperialistic. Those answers are pretty simplistic, and they're pretty problematic. God is trying to...
I just want to say I really appreciate that you threw in what the left, because so many times when we say that there's a problem, we say that it's only on the other side. So if I tend to be on the left, it's only, the way the right people, it's only about gays, and they're wrong because they see it that way. But on the other side, there's as much of a problem. Mm-hmm. So thank you for pointing that out.
Well, I just want to let our viewers understand that I'm an equal opportunity offender. So whether you're on the right, the left, or the middle, I will probably say something that angers you. And if I don't say it in this episode, just wait. I probably will say it later. So
yes, you've offended me many times.
Yes, and you still talk to me, so I don't know if that says something about my charm or something about you. But so yeah. So anyway, and to be fair, the idea that God is punishing us, or the idea that this is a warning from God, can be found in the Bible. You can't really take a Bible verse and say, well, this applies specifically to 21st century America or 21st century Europe or whatever. But the idea that God is using, a plague, or is using war or violence or some horrible atrocity to warn people is in the biblical text. But the problem with just saying, well, here's the story of the Bible, here's the story in the Bible that says God sent this plague to punish the Egyptians or to punish Judah and Israel, is that ignores context, ignores the historical context of the Bible. So, and it's also, like I said, it's a bit reductionist, it's a bit simplistic. So what if instead of being like, oh, these biblical stories that claim that Israel or Judah are being punished for disobeying God, what if we said, oh, that's less about who God is as a being, and it says more about how the people who were undergoing wars, who were undergoing famine, who were in exile, how they were trying to process this event. What if we said,
so I was going on those Google videos, and there was one pastor who was saying that God was using this particular plague to force people, or to encourage people to come to Jesus. So that would be an example of what you're saying is a simplistic understanding or a reductionist understanding of that. I had a problem with him because he said that God wrote the beginning of the story and God wrote the end of the story, and then God left us in the middle to figure it out. And and our choices have great impact. And that's a question of the sovereignty of God, which we'll get to later because I've looked at your notes, but it really bothered me because I don't think that's how it works. You know, it's an understanding of God that's a little different than the one I hold.
True.
I
And
was just
like I said, to be fair, there are biblical passages that seem to give that impression, that this is how God behaves, this is what God does. But another issue with that is that you can justify anything, any viewpoint in the Bible. Christians always accuse other Christians, usually those they don't agree with picking and choosing scriptures to follow. But let's be honest, we all do that. Some of us are just more honest about picking and choosing which scriptures and images of God to prioritize, because the Bible is a massive text written over thousands of years, edited over thousands of years, and compiled over thousands of years by many different people. And the texts don't actually always agree with one another. So what that means is that we as readers reading in 21st century, wherever you are, right now I'm in the United States, we have to read the text critically and make some difficult decisions on interpretations. And we also have to make decisions about which stories and viewpoints we want to elevate. So instead of taking a Bible verse and saying, well, clearly this applies to the pandemic in 2021 and the United States under Trump, we need to ask ourselves what the authors and editors were trying to say about God and or the human condition, and their specific historical context. And then we also need to ask ourselves, is this the viewpoint of God and the human or the human condition that makes sense for the 21st century? Is this the picture of God that we really want to continue to replicate? Do we really want to emphasize this one understanding of God in this particular verse, or chapter over other understandings of God? Because the reality is we are picking and choosing, like all of us are doing this. We justify it in different ways, and I think some of us can justify our picking and choosing in better ways, or much more articulate ways, but the reality is we are still picking and choosing. And so what I ask is, especially when considering the pandemic and considering taking the Bible and applying it to our situation, is, well, do we really want to elevate this understanding of God? Is this understanding of God still useful in the 21st century? And I know that might sound sacrilegious to those who are like, of course we do, because that's what the Bible says. We have to.
I'm just thinking, when I choose which passages I'm going to preach on, I mean, if I'm following the lectionary, there are 3 choices. And I can highlight what I feel called to highlight about God and about the human condition by choosing those scriptures. So yeah, I'm making a decision each Sunday how I'm going to talk about God. I don't know that until right now I've thought of it that way. I'd like to think that I was just listening to the Spirit and being, guided in that way. But if I'm being honest, in my searching for who God is and how God works, I'm going to choose to highlight certain things more than others.
Yeah, and the people who say, well, this is a punishment from God, regardless of whether they're theologically liberal, conservative, whatever, are making certain decisions. And so when they make these statements, you don't just ask, well, is that biblical? You ask, which part of the Bible are they referencing, and which part of the Bible are they disregarding to make the statement? Because I make it very clear that I prioritize a God that's loving, compassionate, that cares for the marginalized. So that sometimes means that it's in conflict with the biblical text, because there are some verses where God doesn't seem to care so much about the marginalized, because God is so concerned about, I'm going to punish you, even if that means that the children and elderly are going to die of a plague or do this or that. So I make it clear that I'm prioritizing verses that talk about God's compassion and justice for the marginalized. Now, that doesn't mean I could ignore the other verses. You can't. They're in our text. But you have to wrestle with them. You have to wrestle about what you think they may have. You have to wrestle with why you think they're included in the biblical text, and two, what those verses said about a particular group of people and their understanding of God, and whether or not we want to continue with that understanding of God, because we don't have to.
Yeah, that's almost heresy.
I'm pretty sure it is heresy. Also, something else for viewers to understand: I am not a pastor, and I think as you hear me talk and explain my theological views, it becomes pretty clear why I'm not a pastor. But yeah, if anyone wants to get me a shirt that says heretical, I would appreciate it.
But it's those heretical or almost heretical statements that shine a light on what we're doing pastorally and continues to call me and other pastors to check ourselves. Now, being Presbyterian, the Church Reformed, and always being Reformed, I know that I have a slant towards getting it wrong. And if I'm not constantly examining and listening to the Spirit, then I could easily wander off into a way that's not jokingly heretical, but that ends up hurting people. And I think that's my problem with thinking the pandemic is God's judgment for our behavior or lack of behavior, is that it adds guilt and shame in a time when we're desperate for hope, for laughter. We haven't had a party in ages. We need to just relax, and we need some of that comforting part of God. Does God if we say that God is not sending this pandemic to judge us, then where is God in this pandemic?
Yes. So the verses and stories that I choose to elevate are those that focus on God that as a comforter, as a source of comfort, but also as one that suffers with us. So Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann, I hope I'm saying it right, in his book Virus as a Summons to Faith, says it is possible to trust that the God of the gospel is in, with, and under the crisis of the virus without imagining that God is the cause of it. So instead of viewing God as an angry judge that decides that these drastic and violent measures are necessary to punish humanity or to even just get our attentions, how about we focus on God as a deity who comforts those who are suffering and who suffers with us? What does that do for our theology? What does that do for a day-to-day action? And the thing is, this image is not something that I'm making up. It's in the Bible. And even when God is supposedly punishing humanity for being like ignorant or disobedient, there are still this undercurrent of God loves and cares for us and will make things right. It's a complicated message for sure, because like I said, I'm personally not a fan of the images of God that depict God as a deity that will inflict massive heartbreak and violence just on people for disobeying them. But the thing is, that's not the only image of God. And sometimes these two images of God as a punishing deity and God as a co-suffering deity coexist in the same chapter, same book, and it's up to us to try and tease out what that means and what that practically looked like. So, for instance, the book of Isaiah is a complicated book. I'm not a biblical scholar, so let me say that. So if any biblical scholars are reading this or listening to this and are like, you're wrong, I'm so sorry. So,
we have comments for that, right?
Yes. But scholars divide the book into different sections. So you have first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah. And let me just make it clear that these categorizations don't mean that there's necessarily just one author for each section. Some scholars think that, for example, third Isaiah may have had multiple authors, and there are reasons for that I won't go into because that's not my area of expertise. But the point of this is that the book of Isaiah encompasses chapters and verses that point out that the Jewish exiles' pain, suffering, and fall from position of power is the result of their disobedience from God. But there are other verses that chronicle the disappointment and heartache of returning from exile, only to discover, hey, things are still pretty sucky. And then there are still other verses that are like, you know what, God will bring restoration. God suffers with you. So all of these images of God are within one text. So it's not clear. It's not as clear as some people who want to say, well, God is doing this or that, make it out to seem. It's not. So one of my favorite verses in Isaiah is 66:12-13, which says, "For thus says the Lord, I will extend prosperity to her like a river, and the wealth of the nations like an overflowing stream. And you shall nurse and be carried on her arm, and dandled, I think, on her knees. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem." So this is a jarring verse in that chapter, because you start off at the beginning of the chapter and it's like, well, this is bad worship. And then the end of the chapter is like, and people who disobey us will suffer from like worms and fire for all of eternity. And in the midst of those two extremes, you have this like beautiful verse about God as a loving mother. And so when I read this, I think, well, what could have inspired the authors to have such a wide range of images for God? And also for the 21st century, which image might be more useful or more easily and justly applicable to this situation? God as a vengeful being, or God as a loving mother? Like, because to say that God is punishing humanity by the plague is to ignore the fact that the majority of the people who are suffering from this are those who are already the most marginalized in society, who don't have access to healthcare, who are Black or brown in the United States, who are Black and brown and often working like jobs that pay hourly, to war-torn countries like in Yemen that are already devastated from horrific war. They're the ones who are suffering the most. So to say that, well, this is a punishment for humanity, it's kind of asked, well, who's actually being punished? It's the most vulnerable. And so that leaves me to question which images are most applicable from the biblical text. And for me, it would be images like God is a mother that comforts us. And from the New Testament, we have multiple images of Jesus suffering. And like one of the things, regardless, I'm not going to get into the different theological views people have on Jesus, this or that, and why Jesus died on the cross, because there are a million different debates and theologies on that. But I think most Christians will argue that Jesus's death and suffering is significant, not just because it's suffering for the sake of suffering, but it's because it's an expression of God suffering with us. It's an expression of God experiencing pain and trauma with us. And even outside of the cross, Jesus is presented as God through Jesus is presenting as experiencing a wide range of emotion, from joy and happiness to anger. I'm going to turn the tables to sadness. I mean, one of my favorite verses or stories is the Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus.
Yeah.
Something else to know about me is that my grammar and pronunciation isn't always great. So, sorry if there are any people who are into grammar, you will hate me. And pronunciation, you will also hate me. So, for instance, in John 11:32-36, Jesus is depicted as being moved by the weeping of those mourning over Lazarus. And I'll just read it real quick. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved them." And then others had said, "But could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So in this chapter, Jesus is portrayed as, intentionally staying in a certain place after after Jesus and the disciples had been told, hey, Lazarus is sick. And then, of course, the end of the chapter, Jesus raises, Lazarus. So it seems like everything is all good. And they're much smarter biblical and scholars and theologians who have treatises written about why Jesus decided to stay an extra 2 days in that place and what the resurrection of Lazarus means about the resurrecting power of God. Like, I'm sorry, that's not me. But what I'm intrigued at is that this response is kind of squished in between, the story of Jesus, intentionally staying an extra 2 days after hearing he's sick, and then Jesus raising him up. Because Jesus isn't, Jesus doesn't like argue with those who are criticizing him or grieving. He doesn't say, well, I'm God, I can do whatever I want. Or he doesn't say, shut up and stop crying, I'm going to fix it. He weeps along with them. And then he brings healing and restoration. Someone who talks about this in a really beautiful way is N.T. Wright, who I don't always agree with theologically, but he's a New Testament scholar. But in his book, God in the Pandemic, he says, so how is Jesus to engage with Martha, Mary, and the critical crowd? He doesn't turn the tables on them and suggest that all this happened because they were sinful and now ought to repent. He just reaps. And then, with the authority born of that mixture of tears and trust, he commands Lazarus to come out of the tomb. If there is a word for our present situation, facing not only a pandemic, but all the consequent social and cultural upheaval, I think it might be right here. So for me, when I read that text, I think, well, what if instead of focusing on the God that uses violence and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people to punish humanity or warn them for some reason or bring them to Jesus, what if we focused on a God that comforts, weeps with us, and provides healing and restoration? What if we focused on what healing and restoration in 2020 would mean? Ideally, it would mean an end to this pandemic, a vaccine, or for it to disappear. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But
I don't think that's what God wants from us. And it's hard to say what I'm trying to say because it sounds awful. But if God wanted everything done neatly and perfectly, there wouldn't be a reason for us. And if God wants us to work with God and to be co-creators, then we see that through God's willingness to suffer with us, because like that one preacher was saying, our choices have consequences. And sometimes our choices lead to good consequences. Sometimes my choices are all perfect and right and good, but you're over there making bad choices, and I feel the consequences of that. So God's calling us to more than being robots doing the exact right thing. God's calling us to create with God, to bring to life this kingdom, or I know kingdom's the proper way to say it now, but I kind of like kingdom simply because it has that feeling that God is holy and bigger than us and truly ruling over us. And that's a whole nother episode about how that works. But still, God is other than us, but God is calling us to work with God, which means that God has to be willing to sit with us when we die, to laugh when we're happy, to cry with us,
Yeah, I agree, and especially the part about, our consequences, because I don't view the pandemic as like God, saying this is what you get for not doing things the way that it should be done. And I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain like how this virus happened, how it occurred, but I can see some of the consequences and what it means to live in a society that devalues certain people. And right. That's not God's judgment, that's our judgment, devaluing other people's life. Like in the US, the majority of people who are getting sick and dying are people of color, and that can be traced to our long history of racism, and also the way we continually devalue Black and brown lives, the way we continually value disabled and elderly lives. That's not God saying these lives are worth less than other lives. It's a judgment that we've made as a society to say, you know what matters? Our economic powerhouse, which, by the way, if I can't imagine hundreds of thousands of people dying is good for our economy either. But what do I know? But that's us saying, you know what matters? Not these people's lives. Capitalism matters. Our economic system matters. Bailing out multi-billion-dollar corporations that, quite frankly, I wonder, people say to poor people, why can't you save for like a rainy day? And I'm like, these multi-billion-dollar corporations are going bankrupt, and you expect people who live paycheck to paycheck to have 6 months worth of savings? More so during the pandemic, that's not going to happen. But we've, as a society, have said that these are what matter to us: multi-billion-dollar corporations, the economy, but like not even economic benefits for everyone, because if we did, we would probably have a universal income or other things like that. But yeah, sorry, a little bit far into politics.
Well, I was gonna go there too, because this has to do with the church itself is complicit in this. I was listening to a podcast, so I'm not a historian, but I was listening to a podcast, and I'm sure that makes me almost a historian, right? But it was talking about Carnegie and how he was a Scottish Presbyterian, and he firmly believed that God had blessed him with the ability to make money. And so he could acquire all the money he wanted to on the backs of these people in horrendous work conditions so that he could give back. And he gave back a lot, and he gave a lot. But the idea that God would bless certain people and again, this is going to get iffy because God does bless certain people with the gift of wealth and they are to share it, but it's not wealth that's earned on the backs of laborers and stuff like that. So anyway, to get back to my point, if I can remember it, it was sinful the way he was using God to justify his wealth creation while devaluing other humans who are made in God's image. And that thought process carries through to today, to the wealthy folks wearing the hashtag blessed t-shirts and feeling like they've won the lottery, so everything should be good for them all the time. And when I say them, I'm talking about me. I'm one of those people, I am way blessed and very fortunate, and I serve a congregation of people who are by and large very fortunate people, with plenty of means, and good health care. So how are we to act in this pandemic? What's God calling us to do in the midst of this when we can keep it, at bay? It's not so much for us.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question, because to me that definitely is at the heart of the matter. Because I think questions about why is this happening, why does God allow this to happen? I think those are important questions, but I think they're ultimately unknowable, and they will change depending on your theology, of course. Someone who is a process theologian who believes we are co-creators with God, or God suffers with us, will have a different understanding than someone who might be a Calvinist.
Be nice to Calvinists.
Hey, are Presbyterians still even Calvinists?
Sort of.
Yeah. Okay, but anyway, so those questions ultimately are unanswerable. They're interesting to talk about. They're interesting to have, a conversation about, but we won't know the answer to them on this side of eternity. But what we can focus on, what we can have answers to is how will we respond? What is our faith compelling us to do? If we believe in a God that's punishing us, or punishing whoever has COVID, or punishing society in general, then that might impact how we view and treat those who are suffering. It might make us less compassionate. It might make us think, oh, well, they deserve it. But if we focus on a God that suffers with us, that um, that understands our pain, that comforts us, then we're more likely to ask critical questions about, like, why are these people suffering while these aren't? Or do we have to do things this way? Like, do we have to live in a nation where the majority of people's health insurance is tied to certain types of jobs? Do we have to live in a society where disabled people and elderly people are viewed as expendable? And we don't. We think critically on these questions, and we start realizing, you know what? We don't have to live in that a type of society. We don't have to continue to view certain people as, expendable and disposable. Instead, we can say, you know what? My faith says that we can do things differently. And my faith says that restoration and healing is not just about, like, the COVID eventually disappearing, going back to normal. It's about creating a new normal where the people who are on the bottom of society or who are viewed as disposable are elevated and treated as the images of God that they are. It says that, the God that, I worship is one that wants justice and compassion. A God that says, you know what, we don't have to rely on, I don't know, sorry, I lost my train of thought at that minute, but we don't have to rely on economic forces to determine who's most productive and valuable. We all each have inherent worth, and we all deserve to be taken care of. We can create a society where people don't have to decide, oh, am I going to get COVID-19 testing, or am I worried that I'm going to be deported? Am I going to get COVID-19 tested and if I'm positive, be hospitalized and also be hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and go bankrupt? We don't have to live in a society that says, that's normal. That's something people should have to grapple with. And so I think as Christians, asking the important questions of why is this happening, that's all well and good, but that ultimately we need to decide how we're going to act. Are we going to be one of those Christians that's like, well, God will protect me from the virus because I personally am obeying God. So it's okay to have 1,000 people worship service where no one wears masks? Or are we going to say, you know what, this is what we need to do to be safe? And I have to say that a majority of the churches across the theological spectrum have been taking that charge seriously. You see on the news people who've been like, I'm going to continue to worship with 1,000 people in a concert with no mask. But you also see a lot more who are like, well, how do we grapple with this? How do we meet in person if we're in an area that happens safely? How do we meet virally, over the internet when not everyone has internet connection? Or what can we do to continue to be the community of God? And how do we continue to help those who are most vulnerable? A good portion of congregations across the theological spectrum are grappling with that. So I have to just say, like, as much as I criticize pastors, no offense, Jen, and the institutional church, a lot have been taking the question of how do we respond to this in a way that's helpful and faithful very seriously, and I appreciate that. But I think that question is what we can control, or I think that question is what we can answer pretty well, because the other question of why is this happening, I don't think we'll have an answer to. Maybe the scientists do, about the origin of the virus. But theologically and philosophically, we're not going to have an answer about why is this happening.
I wanted to throw out that it's not just the pastors who are grappling with it. My session, which are the leaders of the church, those poor folks, there's Chaos's tail got in the screen again. But my session members have been wrestling with this at least as much as I have. And I know that that's true across all the churches here in town, at least. Yeah. And I think you're right. There is no way we're going to answer those philosophical and theological questions. And a lot of following Christ comes down to our day-to-day walk with Christ. And the idea that our goal as Christians should be to live the Lord's Prayer on a daily basis and do the daily bread type activities. take care of what we can take care of in the sphere of influence we have and with the gifts that we've been given. So my congregation is older, so there are people who are generally vulnerable. Not completely. We've got a few people who are young and healthy and ready to go, but for the majority of us, we're trying to protect ourselves and protect one another. So our missions have changed drastically, but we're still engaged in our community and trying to make that difference in the world. Well, that was a lot of theology to process in a little bit of time.
Yeah. And like I said, I apologize for any mispronounced words. Yeah. And if any biblical scholars have an issue with what I say, again, I'm sorry. I probably won't take it back unless it was completely wrong, but yeah.
I'm hoping that all of the people watching will take this with the grace that we will give to others.
Yes.
Because we need a lot of grace, especially when the world is in the state it's in. And your world has snow today?
Yes, but I think it's melting already.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had
It'll
to
be
cover.
back.
I had to cover a plant, so that's
Yeah.
how.
I'm in the northwoods of Wisconsin, so apparently in October it snows. But like I said, it's already melted, but it'll be back. The people who
Wow.
live here have assured me it will be back.
I'm sure. I've heard stories about that sort of thing. Fortunately, in Kansas, we don't get that many days of snow, but being a Texan from birth, it's still a lot colder than I would normally expect life to be. But we have seasons, which is really cool. I love the seasons. And right now, all the leaves are falling, and there's all that hope that comes with harvest and the change of seasons. We know that time will move on until it doesn't anymore, and then we'll get into eschatology, and that will be fun when we talk about, is this the end of the world, and what does the end of the world look like? And I guess we'll get to that conversation at some later point.
Yes.
Well, any final words of wisdom from you or from your 3-year-old that you're watching?
Well, I'm not currently watching her today, but
That's probably good.
yeah. Hold on. There was something that she said recently that I found interesting. So we were playing in the sand like a week or two ago, and she was mumbling something I didn't quite understand. So I asked her to repeat, and then she said, "That's not for you." But then she said it anyway, and she said something like, "I'm in the right place, but I'm still scared." And so I'm just about, and I tried to ask her what she meant by that, and she didn't really know. So she
Well,
just
she's 3.
yeah, she just started playing in the sand again, and I was just like, I don't know what that means or where that comes from, but doesn't that really, that kind of explains this time period, like, of uncertainty, of pain, of suffering, and I don't know if we're in the right place, like, in general, but I know that me personally, this year has been extremely tough, and some things happened that I really wish hadn't, like, both on the pandemic scale and also like non-pandemic related stuff. And so I've just had to sit back and think, you know what, I think I might be where I'm supposed to be, but that doesn't mean I'm not scared. That doesn't mean I still am wondering what's going to happen in the future and what's going to happen tomorrow. And it's okay to have those like fears. It's okay to have those questions. And what really centers me is just the belief that God is with us, that God suffers with us. I don't know if, again, this goes into a different conversation, but I don't know if God is like, I don't know if I necessarily believe that God plans everything out and, this is all part of God's plan for whatever, for me, for humanity. But the idea that God is with us has me believe, maybe I am in the right place, but that doesn't mean I can't be scared as hell.
Yeah, I think think that's a pretty universal. If you can get to be in the right place and to know that you're in the right place, and maybe we're in the right place simply because God is with us. Everywhere we go, everything we're doing, nothing can separate us from the love of God found in Christ Jesus, which my job in life is to proclaim that hope, that no matter how messed up the universe is, God is right there in the mess with us. And God is giving us life and breath and hope and always, always doing a new thing. And that is the best job in the world, to tell people that there is hope no matter what, no matter how bad it seems. There's hope, and all good things in all good time, which is a Grateful Dead quote, which isn't quite Jesus, but pretty close. All right. Well, it was a pleasure seeing you and talking to you. You and I can continue this conversation once I push the record button and we stop that. But
Okay. Yeah, it was great. I really love this.
Yeah.
A chance to talk about theology in a way I haven't done in a while, since my academic journey went in so many different directions and ended up imploding. But so this has been fun, and thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah. What are we talking about next time? Did we decide that yet?
No, but I'm
Okay.
thinking it's November. We should probably talk about faith and politics, regardless of
Okay.
the election.
Okay, we'll do that then. We'll stay tuned for the next one and we'll see what fun we can have. Bye.
Bye.